Annals of Arithmancy, Chapter 20, The Arithmancer's Prophecy. Disclaimer: J.K. Rowling may soon be typical at the rate she's going, but she still owns the franchise. 30th of June, 2012. You may soon be typical. The words resonated with Hermione as she reached the end of the book, even though she didn't fully understand why. It was as delightfully vague as any prophecy in literature, much more so than the real prophecies she'd heard, which cloaked their vagueness in information not known to the listener. The book, Existence, was excellent. In fact, it was so good that it was a candidate for her new favorite science fiction novel. She'd barely been able to put it down since she'd bought it. But that gnawing unease that had grown while she was reading remained. She didn't know what it meant, but there had been parts of the story that had seemed strange and a little disturbing as she read them. So she did something she almost never did. On reaching the end, she turned the page to the afterword. George had learnt to like some sci-fi since they'd been married, though he didn't venture much beyond mainstream fare like Star Wars, and she'd even started Emmy on some simple ones: The Little Prince, June 29, 1999, The Magic School Bus, and so forth. They'd read to both kids from birth, of course, but it was different when they could actually engage. Granted, most of the ones Hermione remembered from her own childhood still went over Emmy's head. Hermione, however, read the stuff regularly, and with Existence, she was reading a good deal more in depth. The afterword didn't tell her much besides the notion, reinforced by subsequent reading, that David Brin was a consummate progressive in the most literal sense of the word, passionate to a fault about the idea of human progress, a radical optimist, though he would deny it, and futurist whilst also facing the dangers confronting society head-on, strongly rejecting any romantic or cynical notion of a past golden age or that the world, at its core, hasn't and can't become better. While interesting, if a little intense for her taste, this didn't help Hermione resolve the unease she was feeling. However, the next page contained a list of follow-up resources, uncommon even for science fiction, starting with Brin's website. So she got up from her chair and took the book into the study. Most of their Muggle neighbors wouldn't see the need for a study anymore, now that laptops and wireless internet had become the norm, but while the Granger Weasleys kept up with developments in the Muggle world, they were late adopters of technology, and they certainly didn't follow the always-on lifestyle many Muggles were developing. Waking up her computer, she went to Brin's website and poked around for a few minutes before stumbling upon The Transparent Society, a non-fiction book of his from way back in 1998. The publicly available first chapter talked of a world where tiny, almost invisible cameras sat on top of every light post, and it presented a choice. Would these cameras be police or public? Would it be surveillance of the people or by the people? Although sensationalized, that was somewhat familiar. London's CCTV system was a pain in the arse for wizards to deal with, and they needed the ministry's liaison to the Prime Minister to keep things running smoothly. She went on. The Wikipedia article on the book had one line in particular. Brin argues that a core level of privacy, protecting our most intimate interactions, may be preserved, despite the rapid proliferation of cameras that become ever smaller, cheaper, and more numerous faster than Moore's Law. Wait, what? Faster than Moore's Law. Moore's Law said that the number of transistors on a computer chip doubled every 18 months, or maybe every 2 years. But why should that apply to cameras? Then it hit her. Digital camera pixels were transistors. Suddenly, all of her thoughts snapped into focus, no pun intended. With smartphones, high-quality cameras were everywhere these days, and they were only going to grow more common. Brin had predicted that privacy could be maintained in private spaces, but that was no help in public, and the problem was growing exponentially worse. Oh God, Hermione whispered. She slumped back in her chair and sat there for a minute, unsure of what to do. Then she suddenly grabbed some paper and started figuring. She needed concrete numbers, and she needed them fast. They were over a decade behind. George and the kids found Hermione hours later in the library poring over magical history books, spell books, and computer printouts all scattered across a large table whilst frantically writing something with a quill. "Oh boy, looks like Mummy's really off to the races today," George said. "Everything okay, dear?" She barely glanced up at him, and his face fell when he saw her expression. Hermione getting lost in her work still happened from time to time, but the look on her face, lost in arithmancy and worried about something, was not a good sign. "Mummy!" Robin squealed happily, oblivious to his mother's mood. He toddled over to her and started hopping up and down by her leg. Hermione bent down and picked the boy up in her arms and brushed his hair out of his eyes. Robin had developed a mop of brown hair that was much curlier than her own, and it seemed too cute to cut short. "Hello, Robin," she said, then paused as if trying to figure out an appropriate thing to say. That happened too when she got into one of her episodes and didn't pay attention to what was going on, but George was glad that didn't happen often enough for the kids to notice. She finally decided on, "Did you have fun playing today?" "Yeah, we explored the 100-acre wood!" Hermione looked down and quirked an eyebrow at her daughter. She was pretty sure she knew who was behind that, since she sincerely doubted Robin knew what an acre was yet, even with her genes. But then she turned to their supervision. "Just on the property," George clarified. "Busy day, then?" She sighed and said, "That's good, Robin," then tapped him on the nose and handed him back to George. "And extremely." "What's wrong, Mummy?" Emmy piped up. Hermione looked down at her and forced a smile that might still fool their 2-year-old, but not their 4-year-old daughter, and was painfully clear to George. "Nothing, Emmy," she said. "Mummy's just very busy today." "You certainly look the part," George said, eyeing the potpourri of papers on the table. "What are you working on?" "A new paper." "Yeah? Looks like you're pretty well engrossed. You make a big new discovery?" Hermione looked him in the eye and said, "George, this may be the most important project of my career." She wasn't smiling as she said it. "Really?" he said in surprise. "Bigger than the antimatter thing beating Voldemort and killing Dementors?" "It could be," she said. George watched his wife carefully for a moment. He rarely saw her this intense, and he wasn't sure he'd seen her look this grim at the same time since the fiasco with Barty Crouch. "Hermione, what's wrong?" he said. "Why aren't you happy if this is so big?" She handed him the top page almost absently. "Read the title." He did, and his face fell while his eyes nearly popped out of his head. "The International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy cannot survive beyond the year 2030. "What's it say, Daddy?" asked Emmy. George spoke slowly. "Emmy, take Robin up to your room, please." He set her brother on the floor. "Mummy and I need to talk in private." "What's going on?" she said. "Just boring grown-up stuff. Go on, you can explore the magic wardrobe thing." "Okay, Daddy," she said. "Come on, Robin." She led him by the hand up to the stairs. "Whew, thank Merlin that still works," he said when they had gone. "I don't think it would have with Ginny at that age." "Ginny had you to get her in trouble, though," Hermione observed. "Fair." George looked back at the page in his hand. "This isn't a prank, is it?" "No, George. Do you think I would prank you about this?" "No, I just had to check. So this is serious?" "Deadly." "How?" "Muggle cameras," she said. "You know how much of a pain all the cameras in London are?" He nodded. Everyone did these days. "Well, they're getting more and more common every year. Better and cheaper, not to mention most Muggles have one in their pocket at all times. And the computers that watch them are getting smarter and more decentralized. It's exponential growth." George stiffened and nodded solemnly. While she'd never fully explained the deplorable word to him, she'd impressed upon him the importance of understanding exponential growth after that, and again when she'd started on the nuclear weapons problem. She'd quoted to him the saying, attributed to Edward Teller, "The extinction of the human race will come from its inability to emotionally comprehend the exponential function." It was serious business. Anything strange or abnormal is more and more likely not just to be caught on camera, but to be uploaded to a server somewhere before we can respond to it, she continued. You can't obviate the internet, and you can't magically wipe a computer that might be in another country. And even if we can handle that, the computers will notice sooner or later. And with technology still improving exponentially, it's going to be soon that the Muggles will notice magic to an extent that we can't cover it up anymore. In 2030? George said shakily. At the longest! That's a 500-fold increase in computing power. I'm being optimistic about Wizard's ability to manage that. He rubbed his forehead. Bloody hell. So, if 2030 is the maximum, what's the minimum? She just raised an eyebrow at him, and he had a feeling he knew the answer. They should have found out already, shouldn't they? No, I don't think should have. Not with us actively maintaining it, but certainly could have. He shook his head in disbelief. I can't... Hermione, this can't be true, he exclaimed. It just can't. Why hasn't anyone else thought of this before now if it's such a problem? Because wizards are backwards and hidebound, she shouted hysterically. I mean, look at us. We should have noticed this 15 years ago when they started putting up CCTV cameras everywhere. But we have high-speed internet, and even I didn't notice it until now. Your father, I love him to death, but the man doesn't know an iPhone from an Etch-a-Sketch. And he's one of the wizards who's actually interested in Muggles. Or I think he's a little better. Not the point, George, she cut him off. It is the point because he's smarter than that, Hermione, he said. We're smarter than that. He pulled her gently close to him. The magical world has kept itself secret for over 300 years. I think we've got this. Hermione took a deep breath and shook her head. I'm sorry, George, but I don't think it can be done. I've been going over and over it all day. I've looked at all the concealing spells in the book and as much information about technological advancement as I can. Well, even you don't know all the magic, you know. It doesn't matter, she said. Exponential growth. Say my figures are way off. Say we can keep that secret until 2040 or 2050. That's another 1,000-fold increase in computing power. By 2050, there's every chance that basically every foot of public space will be under constant, real-time surveillance from a remote location. Any magic not performed specifically in our world will be detected. Accidental magic from Muggleborns will derail any attempt to cover it up. And remember, the Muggles don't have to detect all of it, just a few instances that we can't cover up in time, and that's what's going to happen by 2030, if not sooner. George looked down at the mess of books, printouts, and figures one more time, and then he sat down. Okay, I don't like this, Hermione. If it's true, just walk me through this. The Muggles can't possibly have enough people to watch all this stuff. Hermione sat across from him, holding his hands for comfort. It's not about the people, George, she said. It's about the computers. Every time magic is done, it shows up as a camera glitch, which is fine for humans, we can cover it up. But when computers start scanning the system, they're going to notice. It will happen to cameras in specific areas, and in the case of King's Cross on specific days. They replace the cameras, and it still happens. And eventually someone goes and investigates King's Cross on that particular day. We alter their memory, but we can't wipe their equipment readings without leaving suspicious traces. Not every time. Equipment that breaks or fails when investigating certain places will be suspicious in itself. We can cover it up with the Muggle government and major tech companies, but it's getting easier and easier for Muggles with no connections with either to do the same thing. She went through the technology in more detail for him. How the cameras worked, how they processed the data, where they physically sent it, what was done with it, how it was stored, how it was accessed by Muggles and copied around the internet. George's heart sank as he followed her relentless logic. It was all pointing one place, and he didn't like what he was seeing. "Don't you see what you're doing?" he said. "You're talking about ending the statute of secrecy." "No, I'm talking about the statute failing," she cut in. "That doesn't matter. They could, I don't know, bring you up on sedition charges for this." "They might," she conceded. "Hermione, what about the kids? What will this do to them?" Suddenly, Hermione glared at George with one of the most frightening looks he'd ever witnessed from her. For a moment, he thought she would slap him. "You don't think I've thought about that, George Weasley?" she near-shouted. "All day? How this will affect Emmy and Robin if their mother's branded a dissident? I remember what it was like under Fudge and Umbridge and then under Voldemort. I've been trying to find a way out of this mess, but I can't. I can't see any way Muggle technology stops before it can outthink anything we do to hide. Not without basically destroying the Muggle world. And I can't see any way this doesn't happen in our lifetimes." She waved her papers in his face. "I'm writing this because I believe it's true, George. The statute is going to fail, whether we act or not. Muggle technology is barreling towards us at top speed, and the wizarding world is going to be caught unawares unless we start moving now." "But why does it have to be you?" he pleaded. "Again. Haven't you done enough?" "Damn it all, if you think someone else could make the case just as well, I'd be happy to pawn it off on them. I don't want this job. Not again. I feel like the weight of the world has been on my shoulders since I was 16. But you have a better bloody idea?" She was crying now. George quickly got up and pulled her against his chest. I'm sorry, Hermione," he murmured. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. I just freaked out. This is so far past anything." He stopped speaking and held her for a long time, thinking over everything she'd told him one more time, and then two. He couldn't deny where it was pointing. The trends she showed him. Even if they made it to 2060 or 2070, and realistically, sooner was more likely than later. "Damn it, I hate this, but you're right," he said. "Someone else who's as savvy as you about Muggles, and could come up with the Arithmancy? Fat chance. But you don't deserve this." "What else is new?" she groaned. He tilted her face up to look at him. "Hermione, I'm sorry. I really am with you. You can trust in that. God help me, I don't know how we'll pull it off, but I'm with you. But I'm going to do everything I can to keep the kids out of it. I saw too much of that already with Harry. And you." "I know," she said. "I'm going to do the same, George. And thank you. Together?" "Together," he agreed. 5th of August, 2012. By day 3, the news headlines blared around the magical world. "Granger predicts imminent detection by Muggles," or "Granger calls for end of statute of secrecy." Her last name alone was enough to be recognized the world over, like Einstein a century ago. George had helped her with her task, working in complete secrecy. They spent a whole month perfecting the paper, and the open letter that they sent to the Daily Prophet and several international newspapers on the day of submission. They had sent the paper itself to both Annals of Arithmancy and Challenges in Charming, as well as copies distributed to the Minister's office and the Department of Mysteries on the very day the letter was published, not before. During that month, Hermione and George had prepared for the backlash. They had taken specific steps against the howlers and cursed letters that began coming in the first day. They warned their wizard neighbors that Hermione was about to publish something very controversial, and they gave their Muggle neighbors a cover story about the IRA splinter cell that they had fought in the 90s possibly coming back, so they wouldn't be caught unawares either. And finally, they had a long discussion with Emmy and Robin explaining as much as their 2 young children would understand about the situation. There was a big problem that Mummy and Daddy were trying to fix, they said, and some people would be very mad because people don't always like it when you point out their problems. But it was their responsibility to help fix it before someone got hurt, and they would always make sure Emmy and Robin stayed safe. That was about as much as Robin got anyway. Emmy understood quite a bit more when Hermione explained it to her. Little kids could be amazingly insightful. They told their family pretty late in the process. They didn't think any of them would really try to stop them, but there was sure to be a lot of strife. Harry understood, though. He said it explained a lot of questions he'd thought about over the years, and with Harry and Hermione together, the Weasley family trusted them. By day 3, Hermione's open letter was estimated to be the most widely read article in Britain since the fall of Voldemort. By day 5, it may well have been globally the most widely read news story since the fall of Grindelwald. That was when the Aurors showed up. When the door chime sounded, Hermione checked the enchanted mirror she had placed there. Taking a cue from Muggle security cameras, she had set up a one-way communication mirror on the door to see who was approaching the house. She was a little surprised to see Tonks leading the trio of Aurors. She quickly checked to make sure she looked fully professional and opened the door with a smile. "Good evening, Aurors," she said cheerfully. "I was wondering when you'd show up. To be honest, I was expecting you 2 days ago." Tonks didn't look happy at all, which should have been a red flag. "Hermione, this isn't funny," she said. "You're in real trouble here." Her smile faltered a little. "I figured the Ministry would want to question me after that article. I'm prepared for this. I'll just talk to Minister Roberts." "Hermione!" Tonks cut her off. "If this was just Minister Roberts, we wouldn't need to do this. I think you could talk him around. This is bigger than that. It's the ICW that wants you brought in." Hermione's face fell. "The ICW's getting involved this quickly?" That was when George stepped in. "Hang on," he said. "If the ICW wants to talk to her already, why did they send Aurors for us? Is there a threat against us?" Tonks shook her head vigorously. I mean, probably yes, but that's not the point. Do you know what you've done, Hermione? You called for abolishing the Statute of Secrecy." "I didn't exactly," she started. "Please, you did everything but spell it out. The ICW's bringing you up on charges." Hermione and George were both stunned by that. "Charges?" she said in confusion. "The ICW's? On what grounds? On what jurisdiction?" "International wizarding law. You called for abolishing the statute, and other people believe you. There are others taking up the call. It's already become the beginnings of a movement." "Oh, crap," George said as he clapped a hand to his forehead and the blood drained from his face. "They're charging her under the statute itself? I didn't think that applied." "It doesn't," Hermione said. "I didn't actually break the statute. They can't charge me for supposedly starting a movement." "What? Bloody hell!" Tonks shouted. "Yes, they bloody well can, Hermione. This is why Hogwarts should have got rid of Binns when he died. Muggleborns like you don't know a damned thing about our history. I'm talking about the Pequary Amendment of 1946. It's not breach of statute, it's treason. Waging a war on the Statute of Secrecy itself." Hermione's jaw dropped. "Treason?" she whispered. "Yes, it harkens back to Grindelwald's War. The last serious movement to abolish the Statute of Secrecy was Gilbert Grindelwald's, besides a few radicals in the 60s. The ICW has a long memory, and there are powerful people who have a problem with this." "Oh my God! I'm sorry, but we have to bring you in, Hermione." "What does the Minister say about this?" George said quickly. Tonks shook her head. "You didn't hear it from me, but Minister Roberts is annoyed because you dropped this right before an election season. He's eager to wash his hands of you." Hermione groaned. "Really?" "Yes. Sorry, I do think you still have a lot of allies, but that just makes things more complicated." Hermione nodded. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll go," she said. George put his arm around her protectively. "Are you sure about this, Hermione?" he said. "No, but I'm sure about my maths. The statute is doomed, whether we like it or not. Someone needs to convince the ICW, and if they want me, I might as well do it. Get the kids ready and meet me in the Ministry." She took out her wands and held them out to Tonks. "Do you need these?" Tonks considered, and then waved her off. "Keep them," she said. "I don't want to give those ICW warlocks any more than I have to." She turned and motioned Hermione to accompany them down the path. Once they were far enough to be out of George's earshot, she leaned close and said, "I hope you know what you're doing, Hermione," Tonks said. "I really do. I don't know how much pull they have these days, but the Americans still have the death penalty on the books for this." 12th of August, 2012. As the days went by, Hermione's initial optimism began to falter. Day after day, she sat in her holding cell at ICW headquarters in Switzerland. Robin had had to visit his mother in prison for his 3rd birthday. George was considering sending Emmy to reception rather than homeschooling her if this went on much longer. And her parents were livid that they hadn't been allowed in at all for security reasons. The ICW had clearly judged she should have no contact with Muggles whatsoever, even those who were in the know. Of course, she received little outside contact or news at all. Her imprisonment had become very controversial in Britain, George told her, with a vocal but slim minority who were mostly from her generation, and the one before, supporting her. But the older people who remembered Grindelwald's war, and in the long-lived magical world they were still many, were solidly against her. Roberts refused to budge so far, although that might change as the election approached. Worldwide, the reaction was more negative. Mac USA was entirely against her. The board of Annals of Arithmancy had officially declared neutrality as a cover for publishing her paper in the first place, but several members had signed an open letter saying they had checked her maths, and she was right. The Ogadu Council had released a strongly worded statement that the statute of secrecy was still necessary in Africa to protect magical lives, something she had noted herself in the paper, but it placed them strongly against her as well. Tonks said she suspected the Nigerian Supreme Mugwump was one of those pressing for charges, which was not a good sign. Haiti was the first nation to openly support her, or at least to support her innocence, not necessarily her ideas. India and New Zealand quickly followed. She had a lot of overseas friends by now. All 3 countries had more clout than their Muggle counterparts, but it was a long way from enough to clear her. She was sure they were holding her this long partially out of spite, but from what George told her, they really were assembling the delegates. On Friday, they'd told her she would have a hearing before the ICW on Monday. The more sensational writers, like Rita Skeeter, were calling it the trial of the century, but the British delegate privately told her that it wasn't exactly a trial. Some of the delegates believed her, or at least thought she might be right, and they wanted her testimony. That was good because they weren't wholly against her, but bad because it meant even more suspension of the judicial process. She had no doubt it would become a trial if things went badly. To Hermione's knowledge, no one had openly called for her execution, but it was certainly implied that they wanted to lock her up or monitor her activities basically forever, not to mention taking away her jewelry business. But there was nothing for it. If it were any lesser matter, she would have recanted for the sake of her children, truth be damned. But like too many pioneers of science before her, she knew she was right. The statute would fall within 2 decades, and the wizarding world needed to be ready. She would just have to convince them.